How would Neville Goddard manifest $10,000 today? And why does understanding his method have the power to transform your financial reality more effectively than struggle, effort, or chasing opportunities ever could? This is where it begins, with the realization that how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today is not about forcing money to appear, but about shifting into the state of someone who already has it. This is why it matters, because when your state changes, the world that reflects that state must change with it. This is how the promise unfolds, showing you that financial breakthroughs do not come from trying harder, but from assuming the emotional and mental identity of wealth itself. This is where clarity enters, revealing that the origin of money is not work, luck, or timing, but consciousness. This is the turning point, where you stop asking how the $10,000 will come, and instead begin being the one who already has it. This is where the illusion of hard work falls away, because Neville taught that the outer world is only a shadow cast by the inner self. This is where imagination steps forward as the true source of material change, demonstrating that what you feel and know as true becomes your lived experience. This is how Neville understood money, not as paper or numbers, but as a reflection of self-concept. This is where the inner world leads the outer, meaning your assumptions determine what the world must deliver. This is how assumption becomes reality, the core principle behind how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today. This is where certainty replaces hope, because hope still implies separation from the desired outcome, while certainty embodies it. This is where your state becomes your wealth, making the inner shift the real labor of manifestation. This is how $10,000 becomes inevitable, because once the inner self is wealthy, the outer world must align. This is where resistance dissolves, as you understand the money is not something you get, it is something you allow. This is the moment you see it, that wealth is not earned first, it is assumed first. This is where the bridge of incidents forms, the chain of events that unfolds to bring the $10,000 into your experience without strain or force. This is where the world responds to you, because consciousness is always the first cause. This is how you benefit in this video, because you will learn exactly how to assume the financial identity that manifests $10,000 naturally. This is where the journey truly begins, with the understanding that the power was never outside of you. It has always been within your imagination. Can you imagine the exact moment you stop wanting the $10,000 and start being the person who already possesses it? The moment where desire transforms into identity, and identity becomes reality. This is where it begins to take shape, because how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today is not about wishing or hoping, but about stepping into the emotional certainty of already having received it. This is where the meaning deepens, as you realize that wanting money keeps you in the state of not having it, while assuming wealth dissolves the distance between you and the outcome. This is where understanding turns inward, because the real work is not done through action, but through feeling. This is where truth reveals itself, showing that the subconscious responds not to effort, but to the emotional tone of your being. This is where the shift occurs, the subtle moment where the desire for money fades, because your consciousness has accepted that it is already yours. This is the turning point, where imagination becomes your primary reality, and the physical world simply adjusts to match it. This is where Neville's teaching becomes practical, because he taught that the state you occupy is the cause of everything you experience. This is where you learn to embody wealth the way one wears a familiar coat, comfortably, naturally, without effort. This is where the $10,000 becomes a reflection, not a target, because the outer world must follow the state of the inner self. This is where many fail because they try to manifest while still feeling lack, not realizing the state itself is the manifestation. This is where confidence begins to form, a quiet, unshakable inner knowing that cannot be disturbed by circumstances. This is where resistance falls away, because there is no need to convince, chase, or force anything. This is where Neville's secret becomes alive, the understanding that the assumption of already having creates the experience of already having. This is where the imagination takes full command. crafting scenes that reflect a life where the $10,000 has already been received and spent with ease. This is where your inner conversations shift, speaking to yourself as one who has already crossed the threshold into abundance. This is where faith becomes identity, not something you attempt, but something you are. This is where how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today becomes personal, because it is no longer a concept. It is the state you choose to live in. This is where the bridge of events begins forming quietly in the background, orchestrating the arrival of the $10,000 without strain. This is where you recognize that wealth was never something to pursue, only something to assume and allow to unfold. Picture for a moment the instant you close your eyes and begin to craft a single scene that implies the $10,000 is already in your possession, not a scene where you receive it, but one where the reality of having it is already established. This is where it begins to crystallize, because how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today rests on the power of one imaginal moment felt as real. This is where you choose an event that naturally follows the manifestation, something simple, ordinary, and emotionally grounded. This is where the subtle genius lies, for the subconscious does not respond to drama, it responds to familiarity. This is where you imagine yourself checking your bank app and feeling quietly satisfied, or telling someone you trust that everything is handled now. This is where the scene becomes your anchor, a sensory-rich moment that you return to again and again. This is how the scene becomes alive, not through effort, but through softness, ease, and emotional truth. This is where you allow your senses to join the experience, the warmth in your chest, the calm in your breath, the certainty in your tone. This is where the body participates, because feeling is the language of the subconscious. This is where the world inside becomes brighter than the world outside, until the scene feels more real than the room you are sitting in. This is where the imagination steps into its rightful place as the source of creation. This is where the desire dissolves, because your inner experience confirms the reality is already here. This is where the emotional gap closes, and the subconscious begins to accept the state of already having. This is where the world must respond, because consciousness is the first cause of every physical outcome. This is how Neville simplified manifestation. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, and let the assumption shape the world. This is where the scene becomes your home, the place you return to whenever doubt arises. This is where confidence becomes effortless, because your inner reality is already complete. This is where you understand why how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today requires no visualizing of receiving, only being. This is where you begin living the state, moment by moment, breath by breath. This is where the unseen shift happens, the silent acceptance that now makes the $10,000 inevitable. This is where your inner world has already changed, and the outer world now begins to follow. Now consider this. The moment you stop trying to manifest $10,000 and instead begin to identify as the person who already has $10,000, the entire inner atmosphere of your reality changes in a quiet but irreversible way. This is where the scene begins to expand, because how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today is not simply imagining money, but imagining yourself transformed by its presence. This is how the emotional tone deepens, as you no longer visualize from longing, but from familiarity, comfort, and inner stability. This is where the subconscious begins to accept the new reality, because the subconscious is molded not through effort, but through repeated emotional truth. This is why the feeling matters more than imagery, as the body becomes the vessel through which the new state is expressed and embodied. This is where your inner conversations shift, replacing, "I hope it comes," with, "Of course it's already mine." This is where the assumption solidifies, not through willpower, but through quiet repetition of identity. This is how Neville framed identity as destiny, understanding that the outer world can only echo who you believe yourself to be. This is where self-concept becomes wealth consciousness, meaning the $10,000 is no longer something separate from you, but something that flows because of you. This is where you speak to yourself differently, choosing words that align with certainty instead of doubt. This is how the new state starts influencing decisions, guiding you toward actions that feel natural, aligned, and effortless. This is where old habits fall away naturally, not through discipline, but because they no longer match who you are becoming. This is where calm replaces urgency, as urgency only exists when you believe yourself to be separate from your desire. This is how the bridge of incidents becomes visible, revealing steps that lead to the $10,000 without strain. This is where you recognize subtle alignments, like opportunities, conversations, ideas, and timing arriving with quiet precision. This is where the external world starts echoing the internal, because consciousness is always the first cause. This is how the $10,000 begins moving toward you without force, drawn by the gravitational pull of your assumed identity. This is where gratitude appears as a natural emotion, not forced, but arising from the sense that all is already well. This is how certainty feels: quiet, steady, grounded, not dramatic or overwhelming, but simple and sure. This is where the story continues, with your identity now aligned to the version of you who already has the $10,000, and the world preparing to match it. Suppose you discover that once you have assumed the state of already having $10,000, life begins arranging itself around you in ways that seem natural, ordinary, and yet unmistakably aligned with that new reality. This is the moment where how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today becomes visible, not as wishful thinking, but as the quiet orchestration of events supporting your assumed identity. Here begins the quiet unfolding, where a conversation, a message, an idea, or an unexpected opportunity appears without strain or force. In the stillness of assumption, you begin to notice that circumstances shift not through effort, but through alignment. At the threshold of inner certainty, you realize that what once felt impossible now moves toward you with surprising ease. From the vantage point of already having, every event feels like a step along an invisible path that was always there, waiting for you to step into the state that reveals it. Within the heart of Neville's method, this unfolding is known as the bridge of incidents, the natural sequence of events leading from assumed identity to physical manifestation. Beneath the surface of everyday life, subtle changes begin to echo the new consciousness you now embody. Among the subtle movements of thought, you notice a growing confidence that does not need validation from the external world. Under the soft atmosphere of calm belief, you recognize that the world is no longer something to push against, but something responding to your inner stance. Across the landscape of your inner world, the feeling of already having the $10,000 shapes the tone of every decision and reaction. Through the gentle consistency of your state, the bridge grows clearer, and the next step becomes obvious without effort. Beyond the habits of doubt you once carried, there is a steadiness to your presence that did not exist before. Inside the silent dialogue you hold with yourself, you speak as the one who already has, not the one who hopes to receive. After the emotional shift becomes natural, the search for signs disappears because you simply know. Before the physical world visibly responds, you understand that reality is already rearranging to match your assumption. Around the edges of ordinary circumstances, small confirmations appear, not to convince you, but to reflect the truth you already embody. With the growing clarity of who you now are, you feel no urgency, no impatience, only quiet inevitability. As the bridge of incidents forms effortlessly, you realize that manifestation was never about forcing the world to change, but about allowing the world to mirror the state you live in. And so the journey continues forward, with your inner certainty guiding the unfolding of how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today. Envision a world where your inner dialogue no longer contradicts your desire, where every thought aligns with the identity of already having the $10,000, and your mind becomes the very ground from which wealth emerges effortlessly. This is where the refinement begins, because how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today is sustained by the silent conversations you hold with yourself throughout the day. This is where awareness sharpens, as you begin noticing how many of your thoughts once came from lack, fear, and old financial identity. This is where the internal shift becomes deliberate, choosing words and feelings that match the state you now occupy. This is where the mind becomes a gatekeeper, allowing only what serves your assumed reality to remain. This is where you recognize the difference between wanting money and being the one who has money, and the feeling of the latter becomes your new norm. This is where you begin to correct yourself gently, not with force, but with calm self-assurance every time old thoughts try to return. This is where emotional consistency takes root, not as pressure, but as a natural expression of who you are becoming. This is where inner language becomes the architecture of your reality, shaping your responses, expectations, and self-image. This is where silence becomes powerful, because you no longer argue with doubt, you simply withdraw attention from it. This is where you speak to yourself as one who already possesses, and the subconscious accepts this tone as truth. This is where certainty becomes a quiet background atmosphere, steady and undisturbed by external circumstances. This is where mental discipline stops feeling like work, because it is no longer about correcting yourself, but simply expressing your new identity. This is where wealth consciousness begins to feel natural, familiar, and deeply rooted. This is where your thoughts become aligned with the scene you crafted, reinforcing the emotional reality of already having the $10,000. This is where you no longer seek evidence, because the inner world provides all the confirmation you need. This is where you begin to feel financially safe, not because of the number in your account, but because of the identity you inhabit. This is where trust becomes effortless, because the state itself carries certainty. This is where the manifestation of $10,000 becomes inevitable, not due to effort, but due to the consistency of inner alignment. This is where the journey continues, with your thoughts now fully supporting the identity of the one who already has what they once sought. Think of the moment when your body grows heavy and your mind drifts towards sleep, that delicate threshold between wakefulness and dreaming, where how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today takes on its most potent form. This is where the real magic begins, because Neville taught that the subconscious is most receptive when the conscious mind relaxes and the imagination feels vivid, yet effortless. This is where the feeling of already having the $10,000 becomes a living presence, flooding your senses as if it were happening now. This is how the bridge between thought and reality forms, unseen and unforced, while your body rests and your mind embraces the scene. This is where subtle emotions, contentment, certainty, satisfaction, replace striving, anchoring the inner state of wealth. This is how visualization transforms from a mental exercise into a fully embodied experience, rich with sensory detail and emotional truth. This is where your subconscious begins rearranging circumstances to align with your assumed state without your conscious interference. This is where old doubts quietly dissolve, because the mind no longer clings to lack, but accepts abundance as natural. This is where the narrative of lack is rewritten, replaced by the story of one who already has $10,000, seamlessly integrated into life. This is where repetition becomes effortless, as returning to the imagined scene each night solidifies belief and expectation. This is how nightly practice becomes a seed, planted deep in the fertile soil of your subconscious mind. This is where emotional resonance outperforms logic, because the feeling of reality is stronger than the evidence of the senses. This is where your confidence grows in silence, unseen yet unmistakably powerful. This is where the external world must eventually yield to the inner reality you maintain with precision. This is where the $10,000 no longer exists as a wish, but as a fact in the theater of your mind. This is where subtle synchronicities begin to occur, nudging the physical world into alignment. This is where trust in the unseen becomes natural, not forced or anxious. This is where your imagination functions as a sculptor, shaping reality with each deliberate, calm thought. This is where the line between dream and experience blurs, allowing the subconscious to accept the assumed state fully. This is where the journey continues forward, with your nightly drowsy state serving as the gateway for how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today to become tangible and inevitable. Ask yourself what happens when you stop questioning how the $10,000 will appear and begin trusting the unseen path that Neville Goddard described, the subtle orchestration of life that follows your assumed state without your interference. This is where patience becomes a quiet force, because how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today requires surrender, not struggle, to the flow of consciousness. This is where the mind learns to let go, releasing control over timing, method, and circumstance. This is where inner certainty takes the lead, guiding your thoughts, words, and emotions toward the natural expression of wealth. This is where the bridge of incidents continues to form, invisible yet undeniable, as small shifts in people, events, and opportunities converge toward your assumed reality. This is how the universe becomes a partner rather than a challenge, responding naturally to the frequency of your state. This is where action, if it arises, feels effortless, aligned, and intuitive, rather than forced or anxious. This is where fear of scarcity quietly dissolves, because your inner state no longer resonates with lack. This is where subtle signs are no longer needed, because you operate from certainty rather than validation. This is where the imagination becomes the architect of experience, shaping outcomes with calm, unwavering faith. This is where the outer world mirrors the inner, proving that the $10,000 is already yours in principle, even before manifestation appears. This is where old habits of worry and doubt lose their grip, replaced by a steady, confident awareness of abundance. This is where the story of limitation can no longer find purchase, because you have assumed the state of wealth as your identity. This is where every thought, no matter how small, either reinforces or disrupts the state you maintain, making attention the currency of creation. This is where your body and emotions align, reflecting the certainty of someone who has already received. This is where invisible forces converge around your assumed reality, orchestrating circumstances to match the inner truth. This is where the process becomes effortless, because reality cannot resist the force of a mind fully convinced. This is where how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today moves from concept to lived experience. This is where trust becomes a way of being, steady, calm, and unshakable. This is where the journey of manifestation continues, guided by the quiet, unwavering certainty of your inner state. Consider the possibility that every action you take after assuming the state of having $10,000 flows naturally, effortlessly, and in perfect alignment with the reality you have already imagined. Because how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today does not demand forced effort, but guided movement. This is where intention becomes seamless, as each choice emanates from the certainty of your assumed identity rather than from striving or anxiety. This is how small inspired steps replace frantic activity, allowing your inner state to dictate the rhythm of your outer world. This is where timing feels effortless, because once your consciousness leads, the world responds in synchrony. This is where opportunities present themselves without coercion, appearing as natural extensions of the state you inhabit. This is where resistance diminishes, because every action is reinforced by inner knowing rather than fear of lack. This is where the body moves in harmony with the mind, executing tasks with ease, precision, and confidence. This is where you no longer chase, negotiate, or persuade, but act from the authority of one who already has. This is where decisions are informed by alignment rather than urgency, reflecting the calm certainty of the assumed state. This is how subtle adjustments and inspirations guide you closer to the $10,000 without conscious struggle. This is where consistency becomes effortless, as living in the state of having requires no extra energy, only awareness. This is where the mind and heart work together, ensuring that all outward expressions are congruent with inner reality. This is where alignment replaces doubt, creating an invisible magnet that draws circumstances to match your assumption. This is how external obstacles appear smaller, as your inner certainty reframes every challenge as an opportunity to reinforce the state. This is where timing and action converge perfectly, orchestrated by the invisible hand of assumption. This is where patience becomes active, a steady engagement with life that trusts the process without interference. This is where inspiration replaces effort, and guidance replaces planning, making every step feel natural and inevitable. This is where Neville Goddard Would Manifest $10,000 today transforms from theory to a living, breathing methodology. This is where the outer world reflects your inner state with increasing fidelity. This is where the journey continues forward, each aligned action a quiet testimony to the power of assumed reality. Now consider this. Every time doubt or fear arises, you have the opportunity to reaffirm the state of already having $10,000. Because how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today depends not on the absence of uncertainty, but on your ability to maintain the assumed reality despite it. This is where inner mastery begins, as you notice the fleeting nature of fear and the permanence of your chosen state. This is where awareness acts as a shield, recognizing intrusive thoughts without giving them power. This is how the mind learns to return to certainty effortlessly, like a river flowing back to its course after a brief diversion. This is where imagination overrules skepticism, quietly reinforcing the reality you have created within. This is where the subtle dialogue with your subconscious determines whether your assumptions solidify or falter. This is where emotional resilience strengthens, allowing you to feel secure in your assumption, no matter what appears externally. This is how the process of manifestation becomes unshakable, because your inner state is independent of outer circumstances. This is where the contrast between wanting and having becomes crystal clear, showing you that fear is only a signal of separation from the assumed state. This is where choice becomes powerful, as you deliberately choose to inhabit the feeling of already having the $10,000. This is how repetition of the assumed state gradually dissolves old patterns of scarcity and limitation. This is where subtle affirmations in thought, word, and feeling reinforce the identity of wealth naturally. This is where the bridge of incidents continues to align, unaffected by temporary doubt. This is where patience transforms into quiet confidence, the knowing that all necessary arrangements are forming. This is where each encounter, opportunity, and insight begins to serve the realization of your assumed reality. This is how trust deepens, because the outer world consistently reflects your inner conviction. This is where fear loses its grip, replaced by calm assurance and emotional alignment. This is where how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today becomes increasingly tangible, as evidence accumulates without effort. This is where your inner dialogue, once filled with hesitation, now speaks only of certainty and expectation. This is where the journey continues, with doubt acknowledged, softened, and replaced by the unwavering state of already having. Envision a world where gratitude is not a forced exercise, but the natural expression of already having $10,000. Because how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today is sustained not by effort, but by the emotional resonance of appreciation. This is where the feeling of gratitude amplifies your assumed state, making wealth not just an idea, but a lived experience. This is where every thought and action becomes infused with the quiet joy of abundance, reinforcing your inner reality. This is how gratitude transforms from a polite habit into a vibrational signature that aligns the world with your assumption. This is where the mundane begins to feel miraculous, as the recognition of abundance permeates your daily life. This is where your senses awaken to subtle confirmations, not to convince you, but to reflect the truth you already embody. This is where the heart and mind synchronize, producing an effortless state of satisfaction that cannot be shaken by external appearances. This is where the power of appreciation becomes a conduit, accelerating the manifestation of the $10,000 without strain. This is where the internal experience matters more than any external evidence, because your state is the cause, not the effect. This is where wealth becomes a feeling, and the feeling becomes the law of your reality. This is where habitual acknowledgement of your abundance strengthens the subconscious, ensuring alignment with your assumed state. This is where small joys and successes become mirrors, reminding you that your inner state is already fruitful. This is where the mind no longer lingers on lack or limitation, because appreciation has replaced the old narrative. This is where the bridge of incidents aligns even more smoothly, drawn by the steady rhythm of your grateful consciousness. This is how external circumstances begin to converge effortlessly, responding to the emotional tone you maintain. This is where how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today becomes increasingly visible in tangible ways. This is where the quiet practice of gratitude removes resistance because the subconscious interprets joy as evidence of reality. This is where the inner landscape becomes fertile ground for wealth, where every thought, feeling, and word reinforces abundance. This is where your sense of security and completeness grows, independent of external confirmation. This is where the journey continues, with gratitude as the silent, unshakable companion of your manifested reality. Picture for a moment that wealth is not a number in your bank account, but a frequency, a vibration of calm certainty. That how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today depends on entirely, because when you align your being with abundance, the world must respond in kind. This is where the subtle power of presence becomes undeniable, as your inner state radiates and attracts circumstances that mirror it. This is where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, and opportunities appear naturally to one vibrating with the certainty of already having. This is where thought, feeling, and action merge seamlessly, forming an invisible current that guides reality toward the assumed state. This is how your body becomes an instrument of manifestation, carrying the emotional signature of wealth in posture, tone, and movement. This is where impatience dissolves, because when wealth is a state of being, timing becomes effortless and natural. This is where fear and urgency lose their influence, replaced by calm expectation and quiet confidence. This is where the bridge of incidents continues forming, orchestrated by the steady vibration of your assumed identity. This is how subtle shifts in perception bring clarity to decisions, ensuring alignment with the reality you have assumed. This is where your inner world becomes a powerful magnet, drawing experiences that match the frequency of already having $10,000. This is where your self-concept reinforces the outer manifestation, creating a loop of effortless alignment. This is where old patterns of lack fall away, because the frequency you maintain no longer resonates with scarcity. This is how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today moves from theory into lived, tangible experience. This is where confidence becomes unshakable, because your state is independent of appearances or temporary setbacks. This is where joy and satisfaction become natural companions of your assumed reality, not tools you force or manufacture. This is where you realize that consistency of being is more powerful than frantic action or endless planning. This is where the subconscious faithfully mirrors the frequency you hold, adjusting events to match your internal state. This is where alignment becomes effortless, guided entirely by the vibration of certainty and fulfillment. This is where the $10,000 ceases to be a goal and becomes a reflection of the state you inhabit. This is where the journey moves forward, each moment lived as the person who already possesses the wealth they desire. Ask yourself what happens when you stop chasing signs and start living from the undeniable evidence of your inner state. Because how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today is not confirmed by outer events, but by the unwavering reality you maintain within. This is where clarity emerges, as you realize that signs are merely distractions, temporary confirmations that do not create the substance of manifestation. This is where evidence is redefined, moving from external validation to inner knowing, the calm certainty that $10,000 is already yours. This is where the mind ceases to look outward for reassurance and instead turns inward to the truth of assumed reality. This is how focus shifts from chasing outcomes to embodying the state that produces them effortlessly. This is where patience becomes serene, because the inner certainty no longer requires proof or demonstration. This is where subtle synchronicities occur naturally, not as signs to follow, but as reflections of your internal alignment. This is where the subconscious absorbs the frequency of already having, no longer swayed by temporary appearances. This is how the outer world begins to conform, not because you interpret events, but because your state is undeniable. This is where confidence strengthens, independent of circumstance, rooted in the consistent experience of assumed reality. This is where the $10,000 moves from concept to inevitability, guided silently by your inner conviction. This is where hesitation and doubt are replaced by calm expectation, the knowledge that the bridge of incidents is forming invisibly. This is where action becomes inspired rather than reactive, flowing naturally from the certainty you embody. This is where your imagination remains vivid, sustaining the inner scene as a living reality. This is where old habits of seeking validation fall away, leaving only the quiet power of inner knowing. This is where the process of manifestation accelerates, as the outer world cannot resist the inner truth. This is where every choice and thought reinforces the state you inhabit, amplifying the frequency of abundance. This is where how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today moves beyond theory, becoming the lived experience of consistent inner evidence. This is where your reality begins to mirror the unshakable assumption you maintain. This is where the journey continues, moving steadily toward the inevitable materialization of your assumed wealth. Suppose you discover that persistence is not about repeating actions or forcing outcomes, but about continuously returning to the state of already having $10,000. Because how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today relies on unwavering inner consistency rather than external effort. This is where the subtle power of return becomes apparent, as every time your mind wanders to doubt, you calmly guide it back to the assumed reality. This is where repetition of feeling, not words or actions, solidifies the subconscious acceptance of your wealth. This is where patience and endurance blend into effortless persistence, allowing manifestation to unfold without strain. This is where old beliefs are overwritten, not through argument, but through quiet, repeated assumption. This is how the subconscious begins to accept the new identity as unshakable and natural. This is where the bridge of incidents gains momentum, forming in alignment with the state you hold consistently. This is where small daily returns to the assumed state compound into undeniable inner certainty. This is where the body and emotions sync with the imagination, reflecting the calm authority of someone who already has. This is where the outer world begins to yield, responding to the persistent vibration of abundance within. This is where fear and impatience diminish, replaced by steady assurance. This is how confidence becomes effortless, because the mind and heart no longer resist the reality you embody. This is where the process of manifestation accelerates, not through force, but through persistent alignment. This is where subtle cues, opportunities, and inspirations appear naturally, guided by the inner state. This is where old habits of worry fade, replaced by habitual return to the assumed reality. This is how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today moves from imagination to lived experience, step by step. This is where the quiet strength of persistence ensures that temporary appearances cannot dislodge your certainty. This is where the inner world becomes the unshakable anchor, and the outer world begins to reflect it. This is where your awareness continuously reinforces abundance, making manifestation inevitable. This is where the journey progresses forward, with your persistent inner state guiding the flow of reality toward the $10,000. Envision a world where you release all tension, struggle, and effort, allowing how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today to flow naturally, because the law of assumption operates only when resistance ceases and the state of already having is maintained effortlessly. This is where the concept of non-resistance transforms manifestation from labor to art, where calm certainty replaces worry and impatience. This is where your inner state becomes fluid, moving with life instead of pushing against it, creating harmony between imagination and reality. This is where the mind learns to accept circumstances without judgment, knowing that appearances are irrelevant to the truth of your assumed state. This is how subtle alignment occurs, as the subconscious orchestrates events without interference from doubt or striving. This is where emotional ease becomes the hallmark of your assumed identity, reinforcing the $10,000 as already present. This is where you notice the difference between forcing outcomes and allowing them, the former weakening manifestation, the latter strengthening it. This is how the bridge of incidents unfolds smoothly, without friction or anxiety, because resistance no longer distorts the flow. This is where inner calm becomes a magnetic force, naturally drawing experiences and opportunities aligned with your state. This is where old habits of tension and impatience dissolve, replaced by patient, relaxed certainty. This is where how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today becomes effortless, because effort is unnecessary when your inner state is secure. This is where your imagination operates freely, unburdened by fear of failure or lack. This is how the outer world mirrors your ease, showing that reality conforms to internal states rather than external struggle. This is where subtle synchronicities arise, guiding circumstances toward manifestation without your conscious orchestration. This is where patience is not waiting but relaxed knowing, a powerful state that speeds up outcomes. This is where every thought, word, and feeling reinforces non-resistance, amplifying the inner certainty of wealth. This is where your vibration becomes steady and unwavering, unshakable by appearances or temporary setbacks. This is where the manifestation of $10,000 moves from theory to reality, accelerated by inner harmony. This is where the journey continues, flowing effortlessly, with non-resistance as the guiding principle. This is where the inner state holds the power, and the outer world naturally aligns, confirming the reality of your assumed wealth. Think of the moment when you fully embrace living in the end, feeling and acting as though the $10,000 already exists in your life, because how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today depends entirely on this state of completion, rather than unfinished desire. This is where imagination ceases to be a wish and becomes a reality you inhabit, allowing the subconscious to accept it as truth. This is where every thought, word, and emotion aligns seamlessly with the assumption of having already received the money. This is where the scene you create becomes the natural template for all future experiences, forming a consistent state that the world must echo. This is how the bridge of incidents forms naturally, as events begin to unfold in perfect sequence, without forcing or striving. This is where certainty replaces uncertainty, and doubt no longer intrudes upon the inner narrative. This is where your consciousness resonates with the emotional and mental state of the one who already possesses the $10,000. This is where outer circumstances adjust automatically to match the inner reality, demonstrating the power of living in the end. This is how habits, decisions, and actions flow effortlessly from your assumed state, reinforcing alignment and removing friction. This is where subtle signs, opportunities, and inspirations appear in perfect timing, orchestrated by the subconscious in response to your unwavering belief. This is where the mind becomes an instrument of manifestation, translating inner certainty into outer reality. This is how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today moves from conceptual understanding to lived experience, as the end state dominates perception. This is where patience is replaced by quiet expectation, knowing that the world must reflect what you have assumed. This is where emotional resonance acts as a catalyst, ensuring that the feeling of having precedes the reality of possession. This is where fear and hesitation are dissolved by the full embodiment of the end state. This is where inner alignment becomes effortless, as living in the end eliminates struggle and reinforces certainty. This is how the $10,000 is drawn to you naturally, without pressure, plan, or force, as your consciousness has already created it. This is where the journey continues seamlessly, with each moment confirming and reinforcing the assumed reality. This is where your identity as the possessor of wealth becomes solidified, anchoring all future manifestations. This is where the inner world leads and the outer world follows, making the experience of abundance inevitable. Envision a world where emotion becomes the engine that drives the tin. How Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today. Because the feeling of already having money powers the subconscious to align circumstances with your assumed reality. This is where thought alone is insufficient, and only the full-bodied experience of wealth propels manifestation forward. This is where excitement, satisfaction, and calm certainty intertwine to create a magnetic vibration that the world cannot resist. This is where every subtle emotional nuance reinforces your inner state, shaping events in the outer world. This is how the body becomes a conductor, transmitting the frequency of abundance through posture, tone, and gesture. This is where persistent alignment between feeling and assumption ensures that doubt and worry cannot interfere. This is where the bridge of incidence accelerates, orchestrated by the momentum of emotion rather than effort. This is where your imagination gains vividness, because emotional intensity transforms ideas into experiences. This is how the subconscious is convinced that the $10,000 is already present, eliminating resistance at its source. This is where patience is sustained effortlessly, because the inner feeling already occupies the end result. This is where subtle shifts in perception, inspiration, and timing begin to align perfectly with your state. This is where fear and anxiety lose their potency, replaced by the steady fuel of certainty and satisfaction. This is how Neville Goddard Would Manifest $10,000 Today transforms from technique into a lived, emotional reality. This is where each breath, each thought, each heartbeat reinforces the assumed identity. This is where joy and anticipation become natural companions, guiding manifestation rather than chasing it. This is where inner consistency ensures that the outer world mirrors the emotional truth you maintain. This is where the $10,000 is drawn effortlessly, because the frequency of your feelings has already created it. This is where alignment is no longer deliberate, but automatic, flowing from the emotional reality you inhabit. This is where the journey continues, fueled by the power of feeling, each moment strengthening the certainty of your assumed wealth. This is where emotion and imagination converge to make the $10,000 inevitable, living proof that the inner state always leads the outer world. Envision a world where your subconscious mind becomes the silent partner in how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today, tirelessly aligning circumstances, events, and opportunities to reflect the reality you have assumed. This is where conscious effort fades, because the subconscious does the heavy lifting once it fully accepts the state of already having. This is where repetition of the assumed state imprints a permanent belief into the depths of your mind, guiding all perception and behavior. This is where trust becomes natural, as you witness subtle confirmations emerging without effort or interference. This is how your inner dialogue shifts completely, no longer questioning, but affirming the reality of the $10,000. This is where emotional resonance solidifies the subconscious impression, making the imagined scene feel as real as any memory. This is where small, seemingly insignificant incidents align perfectly, orchestrated by the subconscious to support your assumed state. This is where the body begins to reflect the inner certainty, posture, tone, and energy, all synchronized with the feeling of abundance. This is how the bridge of incidents forms invisibly, connecting imagination to physical reality in ways that appear miraculous yet entirely natural. This is where old patterns of doubt or scarcity are quietly replaced by habitual assumption, creating a foundation of unwavering faith. This is where how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today becomes increasingly tangible, because the subconscious has fully adopted your inner narrative. This is where inspiration and intuition become reliable guides, signaling the next steps without effortful planning. This is where outer events begin to echo the certainty maintained within, confirming that the subconscious has taken over the orchestration. This is where patience and persistence are effortless, because the inner work has already been completed. This is where alignment becomes automatic, no longer dependent on conscious control. This is how wealth manifests naturally when your subconscious fully embodies the assumed state. This is where the $10,000 moves from imagination into reality, drawn by the quiet power of inner conviction. This is where resistance is impossible, because your subconscious now serves as a powerful ally. This is where each moment reinforces your identity as the one who already has the money. This is where the journey continues forward, with the subconscious ensuring that how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today becomes inevitable and effortless. Now consider this, the instant when you recognize that how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today has already begun to unfold, and the outer world starts reflecting the inner state you have faithfully maintained. This is where subtle shifts become undeniable, where coincidences and opportunities align with a precision that feels almost magical. This is where the bridge of incidents reveals itself, connecting your imagined scenes with tangible outcomes in ways that require no effort or forcing. This is where patience and persistence converge, showing that every quiet return to the assumed state has been building toward this moment. This is where the inner knowing solidifies, and you no longer question whether the $10,000 will appear, because evidence of alignment surrounds you. This is where your imagination, consistently and vividly engaged, has primed reality to respond, making the outer manifestation inevitable. This is where confidence becomes unshakable, rooted in the repeated experience of inner certainty over time. This is where the subconscious, fully aligned with your assumed identity, orchestrates circumstances seamlessly, creating opportunities that feel preordained. This is where fear, doubt, and hesitation dissolve completely, replaced by a quiet, unwavering trust in the unseen process. This is how the inner state of already having converts to visible, material results, showing the power of sustained assumption. This is where gratitude becomes immediate and effortless, reinforcing the reality that you are already in possession. This is where every thought, feeling, and action aligns with the energy of abundance, amplifying the manifestation process. This is where the $10,000 appears not as a goal, but as a natural reflection of the state you inhabit. This is where you realize that the law of assumption works silently, consistently, and invisibly, producing outcomes that seem miraculous, yet are perfectly logical. This is where subtle synchronicities confirm that your inner work has borne fruit, connecting events into a coherent path toward your desire. This is where how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today ceases to be theory, becoming lived reality and undeniable proof. This is where inner certainty transforms the perception of time, allowing manifestations to arrive exactly when the alignment is complete. This is where the journey of imagination, assumption, and feeling culminates in visible, tangible wealth. This is where the inner state has triumphed over outer appearances, proving that reality always follows consciousness. This is where the path ahead continues, guided by the certainty, alignment, and unwavering assumption that has made the $10,000 inevitable. Envision a world where the $10,000 has manifested, and yet the true power of how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today lies not in the money itself, but in the integration of the state of wealth into every aspect of your being. This is where the inner reality becomes seamless with the outer, and abundance is no longer an event, but a constant state of consciousness. This is where your identity as someone who naturally attracts and possesses wealth solidifies, carrying effortless confidence into all areas of life. This is where gratitude, calm certainty, and inspired action are woven into the fabric of daily experience, making manifestation a habitual, natural expression. This is where the bridge of incidents continues, now amplified by the established vibration of abundance, ensuring ongoing alignment and opportunity. This is where the subconscious operates fully in concert with your assumed state, orchestrating circumstances, decisions, and timing flawlessly. This is where fear, doubt, and scarcity thinking have no foothold, replaced by the steady presence of trust and inner knowing. This is where your imagination remains a powerful tool, not for longing, but for creating new realities with effortless conviction. This is where the energy of wealth infuses your actions, words, and decisions, attracting opportunities that expand beyond the initial $10,000. This is where how Neville Goddard would manifest $10,000 today transforms from technique to lifestyle, a constant practice of assuming and living from abundance. This is where patience, persistence, and non-resistance converge into a natural rhythm of life aligned with your desires. This is where every choice becomes a reflection of the inner state of having, ensuring that wealth continues to flow without interruption. This is where inspiration, intuition, and alignment operate seamlessly, guiding you toward ever greater manifestations. This is where confidence, once cultivated in imagination, manifests in tangible authority and presence in the world. This is where the inner state radiates outward, shaping relationships, opportunities, and experiences with effortless precision. This is where financial reality mirrors identity, confirming that consciousness always precedes creation. This is where joy, satisfaction, and certainty become the markers of true wealth, independent of external validation. This is where the $10,000 becomes the first visible proof of a life built entirely from the law of assumption, opening doors to limitless possibilities. This is where How Neville Goddard Would Manifest $10,000 Today concludes, not with an end, but with a new beginning, a fully integrated state of abundance that shapes every moment and every future desire. This is where the journey continues, alive in consciousness, with the understanding that the outer world is always a reflection of the inner state, and now you live as proof of that eternal truth.